I'd like to thank you for joining us today at this awesome event, Campus Party Digital Edition, Reboot the World. Taken on its face, Reboot the World sounds like a very tall order. If we did this 6 months ago, even a year ago, we would be thinking, why? Life in all of its normalcy was just going fine, going great for most people. Our biggest problems revolved around simple things like basically our Starbucks mobile order pickup schedules or managing our Netflix binge watching. Fast forward to today, and we see that the majority of the world has been disrupted. We've been deprived of our natural freedoms to move about at will in public. We've lost the ability to determine how and even with whom we connect with. We've been forced to invite the world into our living spaces, our sanctuaries on a daily basis, invading our privacy and exposing our most intimate lives. We even have to think about the air that we're breathing, and more importantly, the people sharing our breathing spaces. In a sense, however, this pandemic has allowed the world to experience, at a visceral level, the plight of those countless millions, possibly billions around the world, who lack these benefits that we consider normal on a daily basis. While we have lost some basic normal freedoms, we've been very fortunate to have a digital facsimile to fall back on. For education, we have our laptops or our tablets and high-speed internet connections to attend virtual school. For work, we've transitioned to Zoom or Meet or Teams to continue to earn money, which we then spend on Amazon or Instacart or Uber Eats or some other platform to get the necessities and also to satisfy our desires. And speaking of desires, for social interactions, we rely on a plethora of social media platforms to stay connected and informed during this crisis. So what's the problem? We're all right. Nothing to see here. Let's keep it moving. But there are billions of people who cannot and will not achieve even our COVID-19 version of normal. They have not had digital connections to study, to work, to play, or even to escape during this pandemic. Women, children, the poor, and people of color, even in the richest nations, have been disproportionately affected. The question then is why? In the past 10, 20, 30 years, billions, if not trillions of dollars have been spent creating opportunities for those less fortunate and less advantaged to catch up technologically. Various projects have been implemented to provide internet connections in rural areas. Funds have been allocated to introduce communities to 21st century education in STEM or STEAM or STREAM or whatever we're calling it today. So why has it failed? Today, I will share insights I've gained and gathered from over 20 some odd years of traveling the globe, living, observing, building, failing, and succeeding on projects involving furthering education and in particular educational technology and its reach. In honor of the big, question now in education surrounding the synchronous or asynchronous learning, I like to take an asynchronous path, jumping from experience to experience, regardless of the order in which I learned them. So hopefully these insights will help us to build a better model for education to technology program development and also sustainability as we orchestrate this reboot. Now, our first stop today is Cambodia. Within a few months, I created a construct, planned and implemented my transfer to Siem Reap, Cambodia, with an idea about how I could modify a startup digital platform I had worked on to provide tech jobs for people in this remote city while I worked on another project. Sounds good, right? Now, the question some of you may be asking is, or should be asking, is why? My answer then probably would have been, well, why not? On the surface, we could say with deep, sincere, heartfelt conviction, well, we have a service that has a very low overhead and that can allow people to earn maybe 2 or 3 times their normal monthly wages. So we pat ourselves on the back as we flew in Superman fashion to save the day. We were even finalists in a global competition for social development. But what were the results? In our case, it was an epic fail. Now, there's a famous question I've heard that actors should ask themselves when they're planning their roles. At least I heard this in a movie, so I'm going to run with it. And actors are meant to say, what is my motivation? Why am I doing? What is my character doing what it's doing? And that's similar for organizations. Most organizations don't ask themselves this question. Or if they do, their answers, while seeming to be outwardly positive, are more self-serving. While I feel brave enough to say that my efforts were a failure, most firms will brand their efforts a success if they garner sufficient media coverage. The all-important photo op or the tax break. Just doing it is enough for them. But it's not enough. Our motivation has to focus on the wants and needs of the community we intend to serve, not on ourselves. Our program communities don't want a savior. They want a guide. Point of practice post-COVID, how do we measure success? By clicks and follows, or by the community metrics? Our next stop is St. Petersburg, Russia. And here we have Kezia and Sabina, two young girls from the Roma community there. I met Kezia and Sabina under less than perfect circumstances on the streets of St. Petersburg one winter. And over the 6 months I lived and worked there, I would run into these girls from time to time, and I had a chance to develop a rudimentary friendship given their zero English and my Tarzan-like Russian. As I reflect on my time with their community, I can see parallels between their experiences and those of similarly displaced groups of people I've had the privilege of working with, such as Syrian refugees in Turkey or other Roma groups, and also children of the undocumented here in the US. It's easy for us to view all poor, homeless, or displaced people with the same lens and therefore adopt a cookie-cutter or a one-size-fits-all approach to program development. However, if we take the time to listen without judgment, suppressing our need to solve their problems expeditiously, we are made aware of the complexities of the situations they're confronting. By learning their stories, we can then provide better, necessarily bespoke solutions. In Lesson 1, we learned to examine our hearts for pure motives to act. Lesson 2 is more about examining these communities by intently listening to their members, to help us uncover the root causes that contribute to the difficulties at hand. Unfortunately, most technology-focused programs are solutions in search of a problem. Judge Judy, a famous TV show, a judge here in America, always mentions having 2 ears and 1 mouth. More time should be spent listening to those we hope to serve, rather than telling them what we want to do for them. The problems we've faced during COVID-19 highlight this lack of listening. Blinded by our experiences, our normal, our lifestyle, we sent millions of iPads and laptops home with children who lack the basic infrastructure to use them, such as internet connections, or in some cases, reliable electricity. As we continue our post-COVID reboot, let's adopt a new strategy where the discovery phase of our program timeline provides us with sufficient time to delve deeply into the lives of those we intend to provide services for. Now, as we leave Russia, we're going to head to Wallops Island, Virginia, and a project that I'm especially fond of, the launch of a student experiment to the International Space Station. I wish I could say I took a ragtag group of kids from the mean streets, and you can fill in the blank with the meanest streeted city you can think of, and took these kids from the wrong side of the tracks, and we made a great space program. Now, while that would make an excellent, feel-good movie, that's not what happened. Instead, I took a group of exceptionally talented and privileged students and assembled a decent, okay space program. All the privilege in the world mattered little here. We would not have succeeded without smart partnerships. Unlike many programs that I've developed, money wasn't the issue here. In order to fly this experiment, we needed intellectual capital. While we could have relied solely on the brains in the room and launched something, it took humility to reach out beyond our expertise to create something remarkable. We partnered with mentors from MIT, several former NASA engineers, and even a former executive of a major gaming company, not to mention the blood, literally, sweat and tears of parents and teachers and, of course, students to make this happen. At the start of the COVID outbreak, schools across the world were scrambling to get anything resembling education to their families. Some of us hit it out of the park, many more of us failed. Even the successes are a bit suspect here in that students who had learning differences, inadequate support in the home, or simply students that were just simply very young and had parents who needed to focus on work suffered. This needn't have been the case. We have had access to XR, meaning AR, VR, or MR, for almost a decade now. We've had MOOCs, distance learning, e-learning school, telepractice, companies with remote and global architectures for decades more than that. While many have been planning for what education will look like in the next X years, the future actually is now. Post-COVID, education leaders need to look beyond their silo of experience and engage more fully with leaders and people and teams in these well-established programs and also in these up-and-coming fields to expand and improve their offerings. Now we're going to go from the launchpad to the Outback to Kununurra, Western Australia. I'm a first-generation American, the child of immigrants from an economically poor but happy island nation. I remember my mother telling me about her first road trip from New York to Florida, through some more rural parts of the country, and the shock she experienced when she discovered that there were pockets of America with people living in abject poverty. Her shock mirrored mine, I think, when I visited the homesteads of some Indigenous Australians. I'd been living in Australia then for a few years and had taken this service trip up from Melbourne with a few friends. While there, we visited many communities. The vast nothingness on the long stretches of highway between them still reverberates in my mind. It was peaceful and yet desolate. Nothing on the highway except for us, a couple birds, and these enormous land trains, which are trucks that pull an obscene amount of trailers that were filled with goods from the beyond somewhere. I wondered then, rightly or wrongly, in an area where something as simple as bread needs to be trucked in, what real chances is there of implementing any real type of technological change? This, compounded with the other suffocating layers of want and need and oppression and lack, was an assault to the mind. Many, many corporations make the big donation, have the swank weekend long orientation with the food and the fanfare, and then disappear, leaving the locals to figure out and troubleshoot problems. I felt guilty of the same. Sure, you can communicate via satellite radio or telephone, but I stayed for 10 days and flew back to the normal, that was Melbourne, and I didn't return, ever. There's a popular adage, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. When you see the scant resources available to the community at hand, no matter how well-intentioned, those words ring hollow. It is irresponsible fiscally, morally, and otherwise to ideate a program, fund it, develop it, and launch it without first calculating the cost and implementing the processes to sustain that program until the needs of the people are met. More than teaching that person to fish, make sure the pond you have them fishing in has enough fish in it to sustain them. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard of and seen electronics that have been donated that wind up collecting dust still in their wrappers and boxes in corners because the recipients lack the expertise to use them. Or worse yet, the gifts given are not suited for the task at hand. Another example of this that comes to mind is when we take inner city and rural kids and we expend the time and energy teaching them how to code and introducing them to AI and machine learning and 3D printing and robotics and virtual reality without actually linking what they're doing in these after-school programs to the lives that they're living day to day. That lack of connection means that only the most dedicated and most brilliant students has any chance of actually making that learning stick and succeeding. Personally, I believe finding that 1 in a million student or that even that 1 in 1,000 is not a good enough return on our investment. We would fire any broker that gave us similar returns in business and finance. Why is it acceptable here? Now we're going to leave Australia and fly a little north to South Korea, where I spent some time, about 3 years, teaching in a farming village called Outback and its neighboring fishing village called Gunjin. Both are about 100 or 200 kilometers south of the DMZ. For me, Korea was a tech lover's paradise. When we in the States were still playing around with our flip phones, making calls to our in-network friends, or rationing our limited number of text messages every month, in Korea, I could use my mobile to pay my bills, watch TV, buy food, play games in color and great graphics. At home, my toilet serenaded me, warmed and cooled me depending on the weather. Even my washing machine played a little song every time a cycle was complete. Then we have this. In a country that produced global tech giants like Samsung and LG, we had these funky cold heaters in the classroom that you had to strike a match, light a piece of paper, and drop in there to actually start the process of heating the classroom. It's been years since I've been in Korea, but this still sticks in my mind. This incongruity between the bleeding edge technology and then the antiquated living side by side. In the classrooms, we use the latest in educational technology to engage the students, yet our efforts were lost on most students. Why? Because they reserved their energies for the Hagwons, the after-school school that trained them to pass first the high school and then the all-important life-determining college entrance exams. While all educators and business leaders understand that creativity and critical thinking skills were important, families understood that these exams were the ticket for their child's success. Now, globally during COVID, major exam systems like the SAT and the IB/DP diploma exams were suspended. In Korea, where families spend up to 70% of their household incomes on academics, how did the pandemic affect their child's ability, which is already very slim at 2%, chances of gaining a spot at one of their elite Ivy-like sky schools? Time will tell. But what time is it? It's 2020. Shouldn't we abandon these antiquated measures of student achievement and adopt solutions that mimic the approach to innovation found in the successful companies like Samsung and LG? We know in technology that we fail forward. We implement agile practices, changing and iterating, innovating on the fly. Assessing mastery of skills does a lot more to prepare students for their future careers, rather than simply passing worthless tests, preparing for the next classroom. Our final stop today is a virtual trip to South Africa with a brief stop in Florida and a long 9-year layover in Turkey. I've spent the bulk of my time with you today talking about the mistakes we've made as a community. So how do we take these simple lessons to reboot the world? It's simple. Actually, I'm lying, it's not simple. A few weeks ago, or maybe it's been a month now, the SpaceX group launched a Dragon capsule that allowed the US to reestablish their ability to launch people to space. I remember watching that broadcast and seeing a Black man who was a former astronaut and 2 women, one white, one Black, sitting side by side, just giddy with excitement, and their excitement was infectious. It was interesting because that visual would not have been possible 50 years ago. A fantasy to some, or a crazy idea to many. At the same time, outside my window, people were gathering to protest the death of George Floyd. Sadly, a less surprising, more realistic visual. We live in a very interesting time that calls upon us to battle many dragons on many fronts. Rebooting this world isn't as simple as pushing a button and waiting for the screen to come back on, and we simply can't bury our heads and pull the plug. In our case, we have to go to the 6th and final lesson, and that is we have to remember what it was like to dream. As a kindergartner, or maybe 1st or 2nd grader, I don't really remember. What I do remember is that an engineer came to our elementary school, and he had a piece of a space shuttle tile, and he asked us to touch one side of the tile with our hands while he lit the other side with a blowtorch. To our amazement, it was cold to the touch. Ironically, as a teenager, my first real work experience was at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. And I got to work in the materials science unit in a building that housed the astronauts before their launch. And also I worked on the launch pad a hair's breadth away from the shuttle. NASA then paid for my college education, and I continued to work for them during my summers. I'm telling you this simply to say, we have no real idea where that spark of hope that lets a child dare to dream comes from. In order to reboot the world, all of us would need to accept the calling that we are all educators, whether we choose to be or not. My love for science and technology came from somewhere. I don't know where it came from. Someone ignited that in me. The last 10 years of my life have been focused on partners and projects in the Middle East and Turkey, especially in bringing VR to education. Now I have the privilege of working with groups in the US and South Africa to help renew the desire to explore space for the next generations. Now the ball is in your court. I really love this quote from Marianne Williamson. It says, "Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God." So, don't be afraid of the light. Accept the challenge and let your light shine. Thanks. We have a question. If humans build an AI for chemistry and medicine, and it generates a vaccine for COVID-19 or any virus that changes science, should humans continue to develop science or expect AI to be the scientist? For sure, humans should continue to develop science. We can't abdicate our responsibility as human beings to technology. And I don't know about you, but every single sci-fi movie, that's not the thing to do. We have a responsibility for our generation and generations following to continue the work that we have and to continue the work and to continue to grow as a species. So definitely not, we would not abdicate that to AI. And thank you very much. We are done. Thank you for joining us.